Welcome back. And of course, just within the last couple of days, the EPA has been in the news a lot. And I am so delighted when we have time to sit down with our good friend Jim Burling. Jim is the Pacific Legal Foundation Vice President of Legal Affairs. And he's authored a book called Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. By the way, very timely, very timely. I'm sure you can get that book. It does have its own website, nowheretolive.org. And of course, Jim's professional website is pacificlegal.org, and there's a picture of that. Pacific Legal, by the way, friends, great organization, frontline, working for you. Support them. Jim, good to see you, friend. How are you, bud?
Hey, it's great to see you, and I'm doing well. Thank you.
Good. Well, the EPA's in the news.
Yes, they are.
Let me just ask you a little off the grid here. What do you think about the changes? They were announced 31 major points, and the EPA is going to go away. What's your take on this, and does it impact your concerns?
Well, the EPA is not going to go away, but I think that finally, after so many years, somebody's trying to inject some kind of sanity into what the EPA is doing. Because, look, environmental regulations are great. We need to protect the environment. Everybody agrees on that. But we don't need to do it in a way that's deliberately designed to throw vast industries out of business in this country, which is what EPA was trying to do under the prior administration. They're passing rules right and left to basically wanted to destroy energy companies, destroy coal companies, destroy companies that make petrochemicals, just to make life incredibly difficult. And I think that we're finally seeing a pushback on that. People are saying that, look, we live in a modern society. We need to have this sort of industry. So for heaven's sakes, let's not throw everything out in order to go back to the Stone Age. So I think we're on the right path.
Do you think it was clearly overstepping its authority?
Oh, in many cases it has been. And that's why the Supreme Court has been hitting back at them one time after another. I mean, we had this case decided last week, San Francisco versus EPA, and San Francisco suing the EPA. Now, you know something's gone awry if a environmentally sensitive, politically correct city like San Francisco finds itself having to sue the EPA. And indeed, San Francisco is tying themselves into knots, saying we have to sue, but we don't really want to win too badly. But they won big time last week against the EPA because EPA had just been gone too far. So if I could explain that, what San Francisco has is like a lot of older cities, an antiquated sewer system. It has one of the plants, the Oceanside plant, serves about 250,000 people, about 250 miles of sewer lines, and everything is fine. It's treated, and the effluent goes out in a 3-mile pipe into the Pacific Ocean. The problem is San Francisco, like many older cities, has a storm sewer system tied into its sewage system. So when you have heavy rain, like San Francisco experienced last night, you have all this water going to the stormwater system, going into the treatment plant, and then going untreated because it's just too much volume, goes untreated into the Pacific Ocean. And San Francisco and EPA have been going back and forth trying to deal with that for years now. And for a long time, there were effluent regulations saying that San Francisco, what it put out was what was technically and financially feasible. They had to comply with best management practices. But EPA, under the rules and regulations that Congress adopted, was given leeway when we had these heavy storm events to have the overflows. And it would cost and will cost tens of billions of dollars to fix the problem. And it's going to be a long process. Well, EPA ran out of patience, and they decided to change the rules and regulations so they weren't looking at what was at the end of the pipe, but was simply saying, look, if the Pacific Ocean is polluted, you, San Francisco, are responsible, and you have to clean it up, and you can be subject to huge fines. And San Francisco was hit with that, and industries and other cities across the country about 6 years ago were hit with these new, vastly more difficult to comply with regulations. And San Francisco said, look, we don't know if we're in violation until it's too late. We don't know if it's caused by the pollutions caused by us or other things going into the ocean, other potential dischargers. And it's very, very unfair. And they asked the courts to overturn it, saying the EPA doesn't have authority under the Clean Water Act. And they, of course, lost at the Ninth Circuit, as everybody loses at the Ninth Circuit. And they went to the Supreme Court. Now, right after they asked the Supreme Court to take the case, the EPA and some environmental groups sued San Francisco under the new regulations. And they were asking for damages that San Francisco says would have cost them over $10 billion. That's a big deal. And when they went to court, what San Francisco said, look, under the 1972 Clean Water Act, you can't have this kind of amorphous, hard to figure out, ambiguous regulation that you don't know if you've been in violation until well after the fact. And San Francisco continued to say that was the kind of regulation that was in place before 1972, and Congress overturned that. Congress had a new law. So San Francisco said, EPA, you're going back to the old law that Congress threw out. And that's exactly what the Supreme Court said. Supreme Court said, look, EPA, you can regulate according to the 1972 Clean Water Act. You cannot regulate according to a 1948 law that Congress overturned and replaced with a new law. And you have to allow San Francisco to follow the law according to, and you, EPA, have to follow the law as well, and not be subject to these regulations that are impossible to follow. So, yeah, EPA, once again, was caught overstepping its jurisdiction. And the bottom line is, look, if EPA doesn't think it has enough authority from Congress to do what it needs to do to clean up the nation's air and water, then EPA should go back to Congress and get the law changed. But EPA cannot unilaterally, on its own, decide, well, this law doesn't give us enough power, so we're just going to rewrite the law and give ourselves more power. EPA can't do that, but they've been struck down time and time again in the last 5 or 6 years for doing exactly that.
That's amazing, Jim. So, wow. If there's other laws out there or regulations that they've imposed without congressional approval, and they try to enforce those without warning the victim, so to speak, isn't that in itself a violation?
Yeah, that certainly is a violation, and EPA has been hit, as I said, several times. There was a big case out of West Virginia where they are putting air regulations in place that would have thrown out vast numbers of coal-fired power plants just on their ear. And Congress never gave EPA that kind of authority, and that's what the Supreme Court said, that EPA cannot engage in these sort of major rulemaking operations without authority from Congress. So if if you've got a little business and EPA comes knocking on the door and says you're violating some regulation, that business should look at the regulation and see, is that regulation something that Congress actually authorized the way they're doing it? And if not, that's a good defense. And EPA has had its hand slapped a number of times now. And I think that part of the 31 measures that the new Secretary Zeldin adopted yesterday is part of that, trying to pare back EPA back to what Congress says it can do, not what EPA would like to do without congressional authority.
Interesting. So what kind of long-term impact will this case have?
This case, I think this case and others like it will have the long-term impact that EPA is going to have to be more careful in hewing to the line of its authority. It simply cannot say anymore that, look, we want to do good things to clean up the air, water, and air, water, and environment in general, and we just are going to take any rules and regulations we think are necessary. No, they can't do that anymore. EPA has to look at the congressional statute that gave it authority and say, does this regulation follow the authority that Congress gave us, or are we exceeding that authority? And EPA is going to have to say, we can only do what Congress authorizes us to do and no more. If we think we should have more authority, we can ask Congress for that, but we can't do it on our own. So I think that's going to have a big impact.
Is the overall ruling statute, if I can use that term, of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, is that the overriding rule for them to operate under?
Yeah, you got for air, the Clean Air Act, for water, Clean Water Act, and then you have the Toxic Substances Control Act. And there are several other environmental statutes as well they operate under. But the primary ones when we're talking about air and water are the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act.
Okay. Let me take a break. Let me say to our viewers and listeners a couple of places that you can get Jim's information. PacificLegal.org. That's where he is the vice president there of legal affairs. His personal book is called Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. This is really, really resourceful. The passion of Jim's. Check it out. Nowhere to Live. And there's a website, nowheretolive.org. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Again, an honor to have back with us today Jim Burling. He's the Pacific Legal Foundation Vice President of Legal Affairs. He does a book out called Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis. Very informative. I would say anybody concerned about this is the book to have. And even you real estate people, you need a copy of this book. You can go to nowheretolive.org, and then the other website is pacificlegal.org. You know, Jim, I think we were all shocked to find out the abuses at the USAID department. I don't think any of us had any idea any of this stuff was going on, and then all of a sudden the covers are pulled off. And the Trump administration wanted to get in there and clean this up, but now the judge stuck his nose in this and said, no, you got to go ahead and pay the $2 billion back that you're withholding. What's this all about?
So this is an astonishing case in many ways. And it goes back to the really age-old battle between the executive president and the Congress. Now, Congress has the authority under the Constitution to appropriate money. Congress says, we want you to spend, money to build a bridge, and $10 million for building a bridge somewhere. And then the executive department, the president, gets to decide how to do that, exactly where the bridge will go, what the bridge will look like, who the contractors are, so on and so forth. And the problem comes up sometimes when Congress appropriates money that the president doesn't want to spend or doesn't want to spend the way that a prior administration may have been spending that money. So that's what happened here. When the president learned about all the ways the money was being spent by USAID and foreign affairs, and the ones that President Trump rattled off on his speech is one thing after another that would just get people's eyes rolling. I mean, why are we spending millions of dollars for LGBTQ plus advocacy in third world countries, right and left? And, what is the public interest in that? So President Trump decided to cut off some of the funding. Of course, he was immediately sued, in this case by a group called itself the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition. And it was saying, look, president has no authority not to spend this money appropriated by Congress. And the president saying, well, I can spend the money in the way I want to. And right now I'm going to put a hold on everything until we figure this out, because a lot of this money is being spent with something that is not in the public interest. In fact, maybe antithetical to what the interests of the United States are by spending money on things that are not going to help us, as the current president says. So you have this battle brewing, and oftentimes when there's a battle between the Congress saying where the money should be spent and the president saying, I don't want to spend it, it goes to the courts. And just to give you an example, I can think back during the Nixon administration, when President Nixon decided to, in his terms, sequester some of this funding that Congress had appropriated, sequester it and basically put it away for a while to figure out what to really do with it. And he was struck, and President Nixon was basically stymied in that effort by the courts, and eventually Congress passed a law saying he couldn't do that. Joe Biden had money that he was, certain appropriations, and he spent money without appropriation from Congress, such as giving the relief to student loan debtors, saying that they don't have to pay their loans. So that's money that he was spending that Congress hadn't expressly appropriated. So in this case, we have a group that's saying, look, we have an interest in the USAID money because we have some contracts. And a district court in early February issued a temporary restraining order prohibiting President Trump from not spending the money. And there are questions whether the court had jurisdiction, and certainly it may or may not have had jurisdiction over the money that the AIDS Vaccine Advocacy Coalition is going to spend. But the whole $2 billion shoot and match, what was his jurisdiction over that when all of the other parties who are beneficiaries of that $2 billion are not in court? only the AIDS Advocacy Coalition. So this got to the district court issued this TR, this temporary restraining order. It got up to a court of appeals, and they kind of waffled back and forth. Justice Roberts put a hold on the lower court decision pending the full Supreme Court taking a look at it. And just a few days ago, the full Supreme Court looked at it, and they decided to let things stay. That is the restriction on President Trump from not spending the money, i.e. he's forced to spend the $2 billion. And the Supreme Court backed out of it, saying, well, look, this case really hasn't been argued properly. It hasn't been, the appeals from the government of the temporary restraining order wasn't done procedurally right. And we're just going to let the order to spend money go forward. And that got four of the justices, Justice Alito, Thomas, Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, very upset. And as Justice Alito said, does a single district court judge who likely lacks jurisdiction have the unchecked power to compel the government of the United States to spend and probably lose forever $2 billion taxpayer dollars? The question should be an emphatic no, but a majority thinks otherwise. I, Justice Alito, am stunned. And that's where we have it right now. Now, on Monday, there is another decision also involving with the same group, the AIDS Advocacy Coalition, dealing with foreign aid. And it had a decision saying that, look, Congress appropriates, the president spends, but the president cannot decide not to spend money. And the president's response is, well, I'm not saying I'm not going to spend it. And, I may indeed fulfill contracts where people have done work for us and we owe them money. Although the proper place to take those cases is in a contract dispute is normally in the Court of Federal Claims. So we have not heard the end of this, because not only is President Trump not wanting to spend the $2 billion for these various foreign aid programs of dubious merit, there are many other things he probably is going to be taking a careful look at, that saying we shouldn't be spending our money on that. I mean, Elon Musk with Doge is talking about trillions of dollars of money that can be saved eventually. And so it's going to create a battle royale, and the courts are going to intervene between Congress appropriating on one hand, the president deciding how and if that money is going to be spent on the other, with eventually the Supreme Court is going to have to get involved in this case and not just simply slough it off like it did last week. And it's going to have to make some really hard decisions of how the Constitution lays the line between Congress, its appropriation power, and the president's power to actually spend that money.
Wow, because what I'm sensing here is an attack on the president's ability to be a CEO.
Yeah, I mean, normally a CEO of a corporation can pull the plug on a branch that is not performing well, a product that isn't working out. The CEO says, pull the plug. Well, here, of course, this president is not exactly like a CEO, because his board of directors is Congress, and Congress is a lot more powerful than your typical board of directors. Congress has powers given it to it in the Constitution to appropriate money. But the appropriation of money and the spending of money are two different things. And the lower court seemed to draw the line one place, saying the president has very little discretion on deciding how to or even if to spend that money. And other courts have probably gone the other way. So we're going to really have to see what kind of power this CEO, that is the president of the United States, really has vis-a-vis Congress and the courts.
There's another factor here, and there seems to be a change in Congress where we could see spending bills be more limited than we see in the future. I mean, we got this budget that's kind of hanging over there in the Senate right now, but the bottom line is the move in Congress is to cut spending. So it's possible appropriations in the future to these types of agencies and programs will be cut.
Oh, I think absolutely they will be, because I don't think anybody in Congress or the general public realized what a lot of this money was going to. And people are writing their congressmen and congresswomen saying, enough is enough. If you want to have targeted foreign aid to do good things in limited ways, fine. But the tens of billions of dollars that we're spending, which is totally unaccountable That's got to stop. And I think Congress and the people want some accounting of how this money is being spent. It's, government, sometimes we think that if we just shovel money at a problem, its problems are going to go away and everybody in the third world is going to love us. Well, it hasn't worked yet. And so maybe we should be more judicious in how we're going to spend that money, and Congress should do that. But that's Congress's prerogative to decide that we're going to spend more or less. And I think Congress is going to probably take a careful look at it, because I don't think anybody realized the extent of how some of this money was being spent and how it was being spent, and whether it was being spent to advance America's interests or some small core of the left wing.
So quickly, Jim, before we run out of time, I understand Congress has the power to appropriate, but is Congress constitutionally legal funding such programs when really the Constitution calls for a defense and a post office, basically?
Yeah, and to regulate interstate commerce. And so that's a really good question, Perry. And I think the bottom line there also is that Congress's powers are limited to those given it to it in the Constitution, and we need to pay more attention to what those limits are.
Good stuff. All right, Jim, in a few moments left, tell us about your book and why people should get it. What's your passion here with this book?
So, Nowhere to Live, The Hidden Story of America's Housing Crisis, is about all the government programs that got us into the housing mess in the first place. Whether that is some of the extremely restrictive exclusionary zoning designed to keep poorer people out of neighborhoods, whether it's the eminent domain abuse of destroying neighborhoods, whether it's overly zealous environmental regulation that prevents people from building homes where people want to live, and the whole panoply of government regulation of the development of housing has caused us to have the shortage that we have today. And so my book goes into that. I talk about the history, starting in the Civil War up to modern times in World War I era, of how these regulations came into place, how the regulations got abused, and ultimately what the solutions are is to let government essentially get out of the way of people who want to build homes where people want to live. So it's, if you like history, I think you like the book. If you like politics, you like it. And if you like to know more about the homeless situation that we have now, with far too many people without enough means to live anywhere but the streets, I think my book, Nowhere to Live, is something that you will find quite enjoyable. And it's written for non-lawyers, by the way. So you don't have to know a lot of legalese to understand.
All right, check it out. Nowheretolive.org is the website. Jim's other site is pacificlegal.org. You know, the American dream to own your own home. Can we really today? That's a question I'll ask you later, because don't pay your taxes. You find out who owns your property, I guess, huh?
Indeed.
Well, good. Good to see you, Jim. God bless you. Thanks for your time, friend. Okay.